My sophomore year of high school, I viewed The Danger of a Single Story, a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi. After the video, I didn't give much thought to it. I thought that a prominent independent African woman had shared her story, and that was it. Looking back on it now, I can identify the effect of cultural imperialism on Ngozi's childhood and her identity. But more importantly, I can look at Ngozi as a fellow human, and not just a woman from a faraway land. In the same way, I graduated to a new level of understanding of the world through the Gap experience. Before the Gap experience, terms like communio, common good, and preferential option for the poor would have rung a political bell in my head. They would have made me formulate a single story. These are nice ways of suggesting communism or socialism, I would have thought. But through the Gap experience, that political bell doesn't ring anymore. Rather, a human bell rings. A bell that alarms for human rights violations and atrocities. And a bell that connects us in communio. What the Gap experience has done for me is taken burning hot political issues and looked at them behind the smokescreen of rhetoric, stigma, and political hype. It's allowed for actual experience with issues to accompany real people suffering from real injustices like systematic poverty, lack of education, corruption, and oppression. I dropped the single stories I had about liberation theology, politics, and about Guatemala. With an open mind, I allowed my experience to unfold organically. I define communio as a way of life that leaves no one out. It oppresses no one, and it empowers everyone. It celebrates people's differences, and it protects the freedom to express those. It's a lofty concept, but it's something to strive for. Guatemala suffers from a history without communio. From its military conquest of the Spanish to the land-grabbing United Fruit Company, it has endured hell. Mayan culture has been destroyed, and children's futures have been stolen. Despite its history of injustice, hegemony, and theft, NGOs are working to spread Guatemala's history so that people can know its horror. Organizations like Hijos de Guatemala, La Casa Memoria, the Martyrs Museum, and the Human Rights Defenders Project exposes that dark history to prevent it from reoccurring. Los Hijos struck me the most when they explained the number 56 in the Capitol Square. I have two beautiful and loving sisters, so when I heard that 56 young women and girls were massacred by the Guatemalan government, it enraged me and it sickened me. But it also made me think about how privileged I am to live in a country that stands by its constitution. When I tried to put myself in the position of a family member of a victim, I could only imagine horror and grief. But most of all, it made me take a look at the root causes of corruption, scandal, and abuse in the Guatemalan government. The Human Rights Defenders Project showed what it meant to live in communio through their accompaniment of survivors and their family. Their group of 5 women who literally accompanied girls fighting for their lives from that shelter fire taught me that communio doesn't have to be a complex service operation. It can just be bearing witness to something or standing with people fighting for their lives. But to understand the root causes of oppression and the disconnect within Guatemala, it wasn't until La Casa Memoria that I actually saw real representations, visuals, and experiences of Guatemala's history. Seeing the Catholic Church involved during colonial rule, and seeing the use of slavery and control over race, religion, and culture gave me a new understanding of dysfunctionality of its government today. With an actively open mind, I accepted what I learned as truth and a valid truth. I escaped the trap of a closed mind and a single story. I had a teacher in high school Mr. Reyes. Behind his keen sense of humor and sarcasm, he was a man who beat the odds. Mr. Reyes grew up in Belize during the 80s. His poor home situation and impoverished neighborhood left him like too many other kids in Central America, stranded. Stranded from opportunity and success, stranded from a future. Miraculously, however, Javier Reyes did find opportunity through a Jesuit mission program in Belize. Through the program, he was able to get a scholarship to study in the United States. Fast forward 20 years, and Javier became a high school English teacher. One of his classes, World Literature, looked at Latin America through a novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called The Autumn of the Patriarch. The novel looked through the eyes of a generic CIA-backed murderous dictator. I remember the feeling of constant loneliness and sadness of the dictator throughout the book. In addition, he showed the movie Pinochet's Last Stand, in which the ruthless Chilean dictator was finally arrested for war crimes and genocide. The point is, Mr. Reyes wanted his majority upper-middle class students to recognize both their material privilege and their country's destructive legacy in Chile and other Latin American countries. Despite his efforts, however, due to my unwillingness to accept the truth or just not wanting to listen, I failed to grasp his lessons fully. I walked away from the class with a better understanding of Latin America and U.S. affairs, but I didn't quite believe that my country could cause such harm in another. Through the experiential learning process of the Gap experience, I was able to rekindle those lessons taught by Mr. Reyes. La Casa de Memoria helped me to understand and rekindle those lessons that he taught. He often criticized American consumerism and the goal of material wealth. The United States' obsession with wealth during and around the turn of the century, including the Roaring '20s, provided reason for the United Fruit Company's land-grabbing habits. Moises from La Casa Memoria broke news to me that the United Fruit Company still lives in Latin America today, just under subsidiary brand names. After touring the museum, I had tangible evidence of continued oppression and economic influence by a reckless multinational corporation. The issues Guatemala faced weren't some far-off problems that I couldn't witness or see myself. They were right in front of me. These issues were laid out by Rob from the Human Rights Defenders Project. He said that the government was so corrupt that government elites didn't want the general public to be educated, and certainly not educated on their oppression, but even generally educated. This is because systematic poverty is linked to lack of education. Politicians can buy voters through quick bribes. Imagining my family or my community being ripped off by a bunch of power-hungry politicians for some food or a few $1,000s sickens me. To look outside onto the streets of Guatemala, knowing that most of the impoverished people don't even know their country's history, is unreal. Yet understanding this reality only came after bearing witness to it. No textbook or lecture could bring me close to the understanding I gained. And the single story I defied from no textbook or lecture could bring me close to the understanding I gained, and the story I found from experience in Guatemala. At the very least, I've taken the lesson of open-mindedness and defeating the single story. I haven't stripped down all of my political beliefs to join At the very least, I've taken away the lesson of open-mindedness and defeating a single story. I haven't rejected every single political belief I've ever had, and I haven't become a radical activist, but I look now at all things, all ideas, and all people with an open mind, and I try my best to shut down the single story in my head. Because life isn't about yourself, it's the people you spend it with. And Leaf Shikoff said, "Don't run